massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between stars like a giant metal flower. Its bright lights flickered against the black sky, and ships from dozens of different worlds came and went from its docking bays. The station was bigger than most cities on Earth, with long arms stretching out in all directions. Each arm held meeting rooms, living quarters, and trading posts where beings from across the galaxy could do business together. Today was special. The Galactic Trade Summit was beginning, and representatives from over 30 different alien species had come to negotiate deals and settle disputes. The station buzzed with activity as translators, diplomats, and security teams prepared for what would be the most important meeting in recent galactic history. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison walked through the main corridor of the human section, checking his team one last time. He was a tall man with short brown hair and serious eyes that missed nothing. His uniform was crisp and clean, with the Earth Defense Force patch on his shoulder. Jake had been chosen to lead the human security detail because he was good at his job and knew how to stay calm when things got dangerous. The human delegation was small compared to the others. Only 12 people had come from Earth, including diplomats, translators, and security personnel. Most of the alien species had brought hundreds of representatives, some had brought thousands, but the humans were determined to prove they belonged here among the great powers of the galaxy. Jake stopped at a window and looked out at the ships docked nearby. He could see the long, sleek vessels of the Centauri Republic, painted in blue and silver. Next to them were the bioships of the Zephyrians, which looked more like giant insects than spacecraft. Further away, he spotted the dark, angular warships of the Cronin Empire. Those ships made him nervous. The Cronins had a reputation for violence and had conquered 17 star systems through brutal warfare. "Worried about something, Jake?" a voice said behind him. He turned to see Amy Carter approaching with a data pad in her hands. Amy was 28 years old with blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore the simple gray uniform of a diplomatic translator, but Jake knew she was much more than that. Amy spoke 14 alien languages fluently and had spent 3 years studying alien cultures at the Diplomatic Academy on Mars. "Just thinking about our neighbors," Jake said, nodding toward the Cronin ships. "Those vessels could probably destroy half the station if they wanted to." Amy looked out the window and frowned. "The Cronins won't start a fight here. Too many witnesses. Too many other species watching. They prefer to bully people when no one else is around." "That's what worries me," Jake said. "Bullies don't like being told no, and from what I've read in the briefings, we're going to have to tell them no quite a few times during these negotiations." Amy nodded. She had read the same briefings. The Cronins wanted exclusive mining rights to asteroid fields that human colonies needed for survival. They also wanted humans to stop expanding into certain areas of space that the Cronins considered their territory. Earth's government had made it clear that neither demand was acceptable. "We knew this wouldn't be easy when we agreed to come here," Amy said. "Humanity is still new to galactic politics. A lot of these species have been dealing with each other for thousands of years. They think we're just primitive newcomers who don't deserve a seat at the big table." Jake watched as a group of Cronin soldiers marched past the window outside. They were huge creatures, nearly 8 feet tall, with thick scales that looked like natural armor. Their faces were reptilian, with yellow eyes and rows of sharp teeth. Each one carried weapons that could probably cut through the station's hull. "Maybe we are newcomers," Jake said, "but we're not primitive. We've got just as much right to be here as anyone else." "Try telling that to General Vexthar," Amy said with a bitter laugh. Vexthar was the leader of the Cronin delegation. He was one of their most famous generals, having conquered 6 worlds in the past decade. Intelligence reports said he was arrogant, violent, and had no respect for species he considered inferior. Unfortunately, that included humans. The 2 humans walked together toward the main conference hall where the opening ceremonies would begin in an hour. The corridors were filled with aliens of all shapes and sizes. Some looked almost human, while others were so strange that Jake had trouble figuring out which end was their head. Translators worked frantically to help different species communicate, while security teams from various worlds tried to keep the peace. "There he is," Amy said quietly, pointing ahead. General Vexthar stood in the center of a group of Cronin officers, near the entrance to the conference hall. He was even bigger than his soldiers, probably close to 9 feet tall, with darker scales and more elaborate armor. Gold markings on his uniform showed his high rank, and a collection of weapons hung from his belt. His yellow eyes swept the crowd like a predator looking for prey. As Jake and Amy approached, they could hear Vexthar talking to his officers in the harsh, growling language of the Cronin Empire. Amy understood every word, and her face grew pale as she listened. "What's he saying?" Jake asked. "He's talking about the human delegation," Amy whispered. "He says we're like children playing with toys we don't understand. He thinks our technology is primitive and our military is a joke. He also says that if we cause any trouble during the negotiations, he'll personally make sure we regret it." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Getting into a fight before the summit even started would be exactly the wrong thing to do. The human delegation needed to prove they were civilized and diplomatic, not hot-headed warriors. Vexthar noticed them approaching and said something to his officers that made them all laugh. The sound was like rocks grinding together. Then the general turned to face the humans directly. "So these are the famous humans I have heard so much about," Vexthar said, in accented but understandable English. His voice was deep and threatening. "You are smaller than I expected. On my world, creatures your size are usually kept as pets or livestock." Jake felt every muscle in his body tense, but he forced himself to remain calm. "General Vexthar, I'm Lieutenant Commander Morrison. This is our translator, Amy Carter. We're looking forward to productive negotiations." Vexthar's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Productive? Yes. I am sure they will be very productive. For the Cronin Empire, at least. Your species will learn its proper place in the galactic order." Amy stepped forward and spoke in perfect Cronin. "General, we hope that all species can benefit from these negotiations. Surely there are arrangements that would satisfy everyone's needs without anyone having to lose face." The general's eyes narrowed. He clearly hadn't expected a human to speak his language so well. For a moment, Jake thought Vexthar might actually be impressed. Then the general's expression turned even more hostile. "Clever little pet," Vexthar said, switching back to English so his officers could understand. "You speak our language, but you do not understand our ways. Strength is the only thing that matters in this galaxy. Your soft words mean nothing to warriors who have conquered worlds." More aliens gathered around to watch the confrontation. Jake could see representatives from the Centauri Republic, the Zephyrian Collective, and several other major powers. Some looked curious, others seemed worried. Everyone understood that tensions between humans and Cronins could affect the entire summit. Ambassador Lisa Bennett appeared at Jake's shoulder. She was the head of the human delegation, an experienced diplomat who had spent years preparing for this moment. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, and her blue suit was formal but practical. "General Vexthar," she said with a polite smile, "I see you've met some of my team. I hope we can work together to find solutions that benefit all our peoples." Vexthar looked down at her like she was an insect. "There is only one solution, human. You will give us what we want, or you will face the consequences. The choice is yours." 3 days had passed since the opening ceremonies, and the negotiations were not going well. The main conference room on Nexus Prime was a circular chamber with a high ceiling and walls made of transparent metal that showed the stars outside. Representatives from 32 different species sat around a massive table, each group speaking in their own language, while translators worked frantically to keep up. The humans sat in a small section between the Centauri delegation and a group of blue-skinned aliens called the Vorthan. Jake Morrison stood against the wall behind Ambassador Bennett, his eyes constantly scanning the room for potential threats. Amy Carter sat at a smaller table nearby, her fingers dancing over a translation device as she converted the rapid conversations from one language to another. The current topic was mining rights in the Kepler sector, a region of space that contained some of the richest asteroid fields in the known galaxy. Several human colonies depended on those asteroids for the rare metals needed to build their ships and power their cities. Without access to those resources, millions of people on Earth's frontier worlds would face starvation and economic collapse. General Vexthar stood at his place at the table, his massive form casting a shadow over the smaller delegates around him. He had been speaking for 20 minutes, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each passing moment. The translation devices around the room struggled to keep up with his rapid, harsh words. The Cronin Empire has the strongest military in this sector, Vexthar declared, slamming his clawed fist on the table. We have conquered 17 star systems through superior strength and tactics. These mining rights belong to us by right of conquest. Ambassador Bennett leaned forward, in her chair. Her voice was calm and professional, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. General, with respect, the Kepler sector has never been under Cronin control. Several species, including humanity, have established legitimate mining operations there over the past decade. We cannot simply abandon our people to satisfy your empire's expansion. The general's yellow eyes fixed on Bennett like a predator selecting prey. Your people are newcomers to this galaxy, human. You have been spacefaring for less than a century. The Cronin Empire has ruled among the stars for over 3,000 years. Your claims mean nothing. Other delegates around the table began to murmur among themselves. The Centauri representative, a tall woman with silver skin, spoke up. The temporal accords clearly state that established mining operations cannot be seized without proper compensation and negotiation. This applies to all species, regardless of their military strength. Vexthar turned his attention to the Centauri delegate, and Jake saw something dangerous flash in those reptilian eyes. The Centauri Republic grows weak, the general growled. You hide behind your laws and treaties while real warriors take what they need. Perhaps it is time for your people to remember what happens to those who stand in the way of the Cronin Empire. The Centauri woman's face went pale, but she did not back down. Are you threatening the Republic, General? I am stating facts, Vexthar replied. The strong survive. The weak serve or die. This is the natural order of the universe. Amy looked up from her translation device, her face flushed with anger. Jake had worked with her long enough to recognize the warning signs. Amy Carter was one of the most professional people he had ever met, but she had limits like everyone else. Ambassador Bennett tried to redirect the conversation. Perhaps we could discuss a compromise. The human colonies in the Kepler sector could share mining rights with Cronin operations. Both our peoples could benefit from increased resource extraction. Vexthar laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Share? The Cronin Empire does not share with inferior species. You will withdraw your pathetic colonies from our territory, or we will remove them for you. Those colonies house over 2 million civilians, Bennett said, her diplomatic composure starting to crack. Men, women, and children who have spent years building new lives on those worlds. We cannot and will not abandon them. The general leaned across the table, bringing his scarred face close to the human ambassador. Then they will die. When we take what is ours, their blood will be on your hands, not mine. Jake felt his hand move toward his weapon, but he forced himself to stop. Drawing a gun in the middle of diplomatic negotiations would be a disaster for humanity's reputation. He had to trust that Ambassador Bennett could handle the situation. But Amy Carter had heard enough. She stood up from her translator's table and walked toward the main conference table. Her movement was smooth and controlled, but Jake could see the fire in her eyes. Several alien delegates noticed her approach and fell silent, curious to see what the young human woman would do. General Vexthar, Amy said in perfect Cronin, her pronunciation flawless despite her anger. You speak of strength and conquest as if they are the only things that matter in this galaxy. But true strength comes from wisdom, from building something better than what came before. Destroying colonies full of innocent people is not strength. It is the act of a coward who cannot create anything himself. The entire conference room fell silent. Even the background hum of the station's life support system seemed to quiet. Jake felt his heart rate spike as he realized what Amy had just done. She had publicly called one of the most dangerous military leaders in the galaxy a coward in his own language in front of representatives from dozens of worlds. Vexthar straightened to his full height, his scales darkening with rage. What did you say to me, little human? Amy did not back down. She stepped closer to the table, her small form dwarfed by the massive alien general. I said you are a coward. A real warrior protects the innocent and builds civilization. You only know how to destroy what others have created. That is not strength. That is fear. Jake started moving toward Amy, but she was too far away and there were too many chairs and delegates between them. He could see other security teams around the room tensing, but none of them were close enough to intervene quickly. The general's clawed hands clenched into fists. You dare insult the Cronin Empire? You dare question my honor in front of these weaklings? I question your methods, Amy replied, still speaking in Cronin so that Vexthar's own officers could understand every word. A true leader finds ways to make his people stronger without crushing others beneath his feet. You are not a leader. You are a destroyer, and destroyers always fall in the end. Other delegates began backing away from the table as they sensed the violence that was about to erupt. The Centauri representative activated an emergency beacon, calling for additional security. The Zephyrian delegation started moving toward the exits. Even some of the Cronin officers looked uncomfortable with how quickly the situation was escalating. Vexthar took a step toward Amy, his massive form looming over her like a mountain. You speak of things you do not understand, human, child. Let me teach you about strength. Ambassador Bennett jumped to her feet. General, please. Miss Carter is a civilian translator. She spoke out of turn, but she meant no real insult to your empire. No, Vexthar said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She meant every word, and she will learn the price of showing disrespect to her betters. Amy stood her ground even as the alien general moved closer. Jake could see her hands trembling slightly, but her voice remained steady. The only thing I disrespect is your willingness to threaten innocent people to get your way. That is not the behavior of a superior being. That is the behavior of a bully who has never learned to solve problems without violence. The insult hit Vexthar like a physical blow. His entire military career was built on intimidation and fear. To be called a bully by a small human woman in front of representatives from across the galaxy was more than his pride could bear. Enough, he roared, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. Jake started running toward the table, pushing past startled delegates and overturned chairs. He could see what was about to happen, but he was still too far away to stop it. General Vexthar raised his massive clawed hand and struck Amy Carter across the face with enough force to lift her off her feet and send her sprawling across the polished floor of the conference chamber. The sound of the impact echoed through the suddenly silent room like a gunshot. Amy Carter lay on the cold metal floor of the conference chamber, blood trickling from her split lip where General Vexthar's clawed hand had struck her. The taste of copper filled her mouth, and her vision blurred for a moment as pain shot through her skull. Around her, the massive conference room had fallen into complete silence. 32 different alien species watched in shock as the young human woman slowly pushed herself up on her elbows. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. The alien delegates stared in stunned disbelief. Some had recording devices running, capturing every moment of the incident. Others were already calculating how this would affect their own political positions. The Centauri representative covered her mouth with her silver hand. Even the Cronin officers behind Vexthar looked uncomfortable with what their general had just done. Jake Morrison was still 20 feet away, pushing through overturned chairs and startled delegates. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but he stopped himself. Drawing a weapon in the middle of a diplomatic summit would violate every treaty humanity had signed with the galactic community. It would give the other species exactly the excuse they needed to brand humans as violent savages who could not be trusted. Ambassador Bennett stood frozen at her place at the table, her face white with shock and anger. She had spent years preparing for this summit, years learning the complex rules of galactic diplomacy. But nothing in her training had prepared her for watching a member of her team be assaulted in front of representatives from across the galaxy. Then Amy Carter did something that no one expected. She wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand and slowly stood up. Her legs were shaky and she had to use a nearby chair for support, but she managed to get to her feet. When she looked up at General Vexthar, there was no fear in her eyes. Instead, there was something cold and calculating that made the massive alien general take a step backward. "General," Amy said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber despite her injured lip. "You have just made the worst mistake of your very long life." Her words were spoken in English, but the translation devices around the room immediately converted them into dozens of different languages. Every delegate in the conference chamber heard the threat, and many of them began to understand that something had changed in the last few seconds. Jake Morrison finally reached the center of the room and moved to Amy's side. His movements were controlled and professional, but there was something dangerous in the way he carried himself. The other delegates noticed it too. This was not the same relaxed security officer who had been standing quietly against the wall just moments before. "Sir," Jake said, addressing Vexthar with icy politeness that was somehow more threatening than any shout could have been, "I believe you misunderstand the nature of human diplomatic immunity. When you struck Miss Carter, you did not just assault a translator. You assaulted a commissioned officer in the Earth Defense Force." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled delegates. Amy Carter was not just a civilian translator working for the Diplomatic Corps. She was Lieutenant Amy Carter, Earth Defense Intelligence operating under diplomatic cover. The assault on her person was not just a breach of protocol. Under both human and galactic law, it was an act of war. Several alien species began emergency communications with their home governments. The Zephyrian delegation activated their quantum communicators. The Vorthon representatives started broadcasting urgent messages. Even species that had no direct involvement in human affairs understood that they were witnessing something that could reshape the entire balance of power in the galaxy. General Vexthar laughed, but the sound was less confident than before. "You think your pathetic species frightens the Cronin Empire? I have conquered 6 worlds in the past decade. I have led armies that have crushed entire civilizations. Your military is nothing more than children playing with toys they barely understand." Amy stood straighter, ignoring the pain in her jaw. The diplomatic mask she had worn for 3 years had completely fallen away, revealing something that made even the Cronin officers behind their general shift nervously. "General," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You are about to discover why every species that has underestimated humanity has learned to regret it. The only question is whether you will be alive long enough to pass that lesson on to your successors." The words hit the conference room like a physical force. The Centauri representative began backing toward the exits. The Zephyrian delegates activated their personal protection fields. Even the normally fearless Cronin soldiers seemed to be reconsidering their positions. But Vexthar was too proud and too angry to recognize the danger he had created. His yellow eyes blazed with fury as he looked down at the small human woman who dared to threaten him. "Empty words from a weak species," he snarled. "Your Earth Defense Force is a joke. You have no real warships, no experienced soldiers, no weapons that could threaten the Cronin Empire. You are insects pretending to be warriors." Ambassador Bennett found her voice at last. "General Vexthar, you have committed an act of war against the Earth Defense Force. I strongly advise you to consider the consequences of your actions before this situation escalates beyond anyone's ability to control it." The general turned his attention to Bennett, his massive form towering over the diplomatic table. "Consequences? What consequences could your primitive species possibly impose on the Cronin Empire? You have been spacefaring for less than a century. We have been conquering worlds since before your ancestors discovered fire." Jake Morrison stepped forward, placing himself between Amy and the general. His hand rested casually on his sidearm, and every security officer in the room tensed. "Sir, you might want to reconsider your assessment of human capabilities. We may be new to galactic politics, but we are not new to warfare." "Warfare?" Vexthar laughed again, but there was a nervous edge to the sound now. "You have fought a few border skirmishes with mining pirates and patrol vessels. You have never faced a real military force. You have never seen what happens when the Cronin Empire decides to crush an enemy completely." Amy wiped more blood from her mouth and smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "General, your intelligence reports are sadly out of date. You seem To think that humanity has been sitting quietly in our corner of the galaxy, building farms and trading posts. You have no idea what we have actually been doing for the past 50 years. Something in her tone made the alien delegates around the room start moving toward the exits more urgently. The Centauri representative was already at the door, speaking rapidly into her communicator. The Zephyrian delegation had formed a protective circle around their ambassador. Even some of the minor species that had been mostly silent during the negotiations were beginning to evacuate the chamber. Vexthar noticed the movement and felt a flicker of uncertainty. "What are you talking about, human?" Jake Morrison answered for her. "Sir, you have been operating under the assumption that humanity's military consists of a few patrol ships and planetary defense forces. That assumption is about to cost you everything you have spent your career building." The general's clawed hands clenched into fists. "You dare threaten the Cronin Empire? You dare suggest that your insignificant species could challenge our military might?" "I am not threatening anyone," Jake replied calmly. "I am simply informing you that assaulting Lieutenant Carter has activated certain protocols that were put in place specifically for situations like this one. Protocols that you should have learned about before you decided to strike a human officer in front of witnesses from 32 different worlds." Amy straightened her uniform and looked directly at Vexthar. "General, in approximately 6 hours you are going to receive a communication from Admiral Kate Sullivan of the Earth Defense Force. She will politely request that you surrender yourself for trial on charges of assault against a diplomatic officer and acts of war against humanity. I strongly recommend that you accept her request." "And if I refuse," Vexthar snarled. Amy's smile grew wider and more dangerous. "Then you will discover that humanity's definition of diplomacy includes some very creative interpretations of proportional response. We learned a long time ago that bullies only understand one language. We have become very fluent in that language." The general raised his hand as if to strike her again, but Jake Morrison moved faster than anyone expected. His hand shot out and caught Vexthar's wrist before the blow could land. The alien general was twice Jake's size and probably 3 times his weight, but somehow the human security officer held him motionless. "Sir," Jake said quietly, "I would not recommend making that mistake twice." For the first time since the incident began, General Vexthar looked genuinely uncertain. He tried to pull his arm free, but Jake's grip was like steel. Around the room, the remaining delegates watched in fascination, as a human half the general's size held one of the galaxy's most feared military leaders in place. "How?" Vexthar whispered. Amy Carter answered him. "Because, General, you have been making the same mistake that every bully in the galaxy eventually makes. You assumed that being bigger and louder made you stronger. You are about to learn the difference between size and strength." 6 hours passed faster than anyone expected. The news of what happened in the conference room spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Every major news network, every government intelligence service, and every military command center received detailed reports of the incident. The assault on Lieutenant Amy Carter was broadcast on thousands of worlds, and the reactions were immediate and intense. On Nexus Prime, the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been busy diplomatic activity just hours before, now there was nervous tension. Most of the alien delegations had moved their people to secure areas of the station. Emergency protocols were activated. Security teams from a dozen different species patrolled the corridors, but everyone was waiting for something to happen. General Vexthar sat in his private quarters aboard his flagship, the Devastator, which was docked at the station. The massive Cronin warship was one of the most feared vessels in the galaxy, with enough firepower to destroy small moons. But for the first time in his long military career, the general was not confident in his ship's ability to protect him. His communication officer, a smaller Cronin named Captain Krex, approached his command chair with obvious nervousness. "General, we are receiving an incoming transmission on all frequencies. The source identifies itself as Admiral Kate Sullivan of the Earth Defense Force." Vexthar's yellow eyes narrowed. "Put it through." The main screen flickered to life, showing a woman in her 50s with gray hair and steel blue eyes. She wore a uniform that looked simple compared to the elaborate armor of Cronin officers. but there was something about her bearing that commanded immediate respect. Behind her, the bridge of her ship was visible, filled with humans working at stations covered in technology that looked far more advanced than anything the Cronins had seen before. "General Vexthar," Admiral Sullivan said in a calm, professional voice. "I am Admiral Kate Sullivan, commanding the Earth Defense Force Response Fleet. You have been charged with assault against a diplomatic officer and acts of war against humanity. I am here to offer you the opportunity to surrender peacefully and face trial according to galactic law." The general leaned forward in his chair, trying to project the same intimidating presence that had served him well for decades. "Admiral, you are making a serious mistake. The Cronin Empire does not surrender to anyone, especially not to a species of primitives who barely understand space travel." Sullivan's expression did not change. "General, I want to be very clear about your situation. Your actions against Lieutenant Carter have been witnessed by representatives from 32 different species. Under Section 7 of the Galactic Accords, assault against a diplomatic officer constitutes an act of war. You have given us legal justification for any response we choose to make." "Legal justification?" Vexthar laughed, but the sound was hollow. "Your pathetic species has no military capable of threatening the Cronin Empire. I have 17 star systems under my command, and a fleet of over 2,000 warships. What could you possibly do to me?" The Admiral's lips curved into a slight smile that somehow managed to be more threatening than any snarl. "General, you seem to be operating under several misconceptions about human capabilities. Allow me to correct them." On the main screen behind Sullivan, a tactical display appeared showing the space around Nexus Prime. Red dots marked the positions of Cronin vessels, including Vexthar's flagship and its escort fleet of 12 heavy cruisers. The display also showed the neutral vessels belonging to other species marked in yellow. Then blue dots began appearing on the screen. At first, there were just a few, but more kept materializing as human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Within minutes, the display showed over 50 blue dots surrounding the Cronin fleet. "Impossible," Captain Krex whispered from his position at the sensor station. "Our sensors show no ships in those positions." Admiral Sullivan heard him through the open communication channel. "Captain, your sensors are detecting exactly what we want them to detect. Humanity has had 50 years to study alien technology, including Cronin stealth systems. We have made several improvements." More blue dots appeared on the tactical display. Then more. The human fleet grew from 50 ships to 100, then to 200. Each vessel that decloaked was larger and more advanced than anything the Cronins had ever seen. The flagship alone was twice the size of Vexthar's Devastator, and it bristled with weapons that seemed to bend light around them. General Vexthar felt something he had not experienced in decades: fear. "What is that ship?" "That is the ESS Retribution," Sullivan replied. "The first of humanity's new generation of warships. She incorporates technology that we have developed through careful study of every alien species we have encountered over the past half-century. Her AI system, which we call Zeus, has been programmed with tactical data from over 3,000 different battles fought by various galactic civilizations." The Cronin general stared at the display in growing horror. The human fleet had not just appeared out of nowhere. It had surrounded his forces completely, cutting off every possible escape route. His escort fleet of 12 heavy cruisers, which had seemed like overwhelming force just hours ago, now looked like toys compared to the massive human vessels. "This is impossible," Vexthar said, his voice cracking slightly. "Human technology is primitive. Your species has only been in space for a century." Admiral Sullivan's expression remained calm. "General, humanity has always been very good at learning from others. When we first encountered alien technology, we did not just copy it, we improved it. When we met species with faster-than-light travel, we built better engines. When we found civilizations with advanced weapons, we designed superior ones. The mistake every species makes is assuming that being new to space travel means being inferior at warfare." On the tactical display, targeting systems from the human ships began locking onto every Cronin vessel. Red warning lights flashed on. the bridge of the Devastator as the ship's defensive systems detected the incoming targeting signals. Captain Krex looked up from his station with panic in his eyes. "General, they have weapons lock on all our ships. Our shields cannot deflect whatever energy signatures they are using." Vexthar felt his carefully constructed reputation crumbling around him. For 30 years, he had built his career on the fear that other species felt when they faced Cronin military might. He had conquered worlds by convincing their defenders that resistance was hopeless. Now, he was on the receiving end of that same psychological warfare, and he understood for the first time how terrifying it was. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to make a choice," Admiral Sullivan replied. "You can surrender yourself for trial, and your fleet can return to Cronin space without further incident, or you can resist, and we will demonstrate why humanity has become the galaxy's newest apex predator." The general looked around his bridge at his officers. These were warriors who had followed him through dozens of campaigns, who had never shown fear in the face of any enemy. Now they were all staring at him with expressions of barely controlled terror. "And if I surrender?" Vexthar asked. "You will be tried according to galactic law for assault against a diplomatic officer. If convicted, you will serve an appropriate sentence. Your empire will pay reparations to Lieutenant Carter and will withdraw all claims to the Kepler sector mining rights. In exchange, there will be no further military action. And if I refuse?" Admiral Sullivan's smile disappeared entirely. "Then we will show the galaxy what happens when someone makes the mistake of harming our people. General, every species that has underestimated humanity has learned to regret it. The question is whether you want to be remembered as the leader who learned that lesson the easy way or the hard way." The bridge of the Devastator fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the occasional beep from monitoring equipment. Vexthar could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for his decision. Outside the ship, 200 human vessels waited in perfect formation, their weapons trained on his fleet. For the first time in his long military career, General Vexthar understood what it felt like to be completely outmatched. General Vexthar stared at the tactical display for a long moment, watching the blue dots that represented humanity's fleet surrounding his forces. His pride, his reputation, and his entire understanding of galactic power had been shattered in the space of 6 hours. The silence on his bridge stretched until it became unbearable. "I will not surrender to primitives," he said finally, his voice regaining some of its old strength. "The Cronin Empire does not bow to anyone." Admiral Sullivan nodded as if she had expected this response. "Very well, General. You have made your choice. All human vessels, this is Admiral Sullivan. Authorization Code Alpha 77. Engage defensive protocols and prepare to demonstrate human capabilities." The communication channel closed, leaving Vexthar alone with his crew. Around him, his officers waited for orders, but the general found himself frozen with indecision. Every tactical manual he had ever studied, every battle he had ever fought, had prepared him for conflicts where he held the advantage. This was entirely different. "Sir," Captain Krex said quietly, "perhaps we should reconsider. The humans have clearly been planning this response for some time. Our intelligence reports were wrong about their capabilities." Vexthar spun toward his subordinate, yellow eyes blazing with fury. "Are you suggesting that I surrender to a species that was building mud huts when the Cronin Empire was conquering star systems?" Before Krex could answer, every alarm on the bridge began screaming at once. The tactical display exploded with warning symbols as the human fleet moved into action. But instead of opening fire, something far more sophisticated and terrifying happened. The human ships began systematically disabling every Cronin vessel without destroying them. Targeting beams that seemed to ignore shields entirely reached out and touched critical systems on each ship. Engines shut down. Weapon systems went offline. Communication arrays stopped working. Life support remained functional, but every other system simply stopped responding to commands. "What are they doing?" Vexthar demanded, watching in horror as his entire fleet was neutralized in minutes. His engineering officer looked up from her station with wide, frightened eyes. "Sir, they are not destroying our ships. They are turning them off." Our engines, weapons, shields, everything except life support has been remotely disabled. I have never seen technology capable of this. On the main screen, Admiral Sullivan's image reappeared. Her expression was calm and professional, but there was steel in her voice. General Vexthar, your fleet has been disabled but not destroyed. This is a demonstration of restraint. We could have annihilated every ship in your formation, but we chose not to. I want you to understand the difference between mercy and weakness. The general felt his legs give out beneath him, and he collapsed into his command chair. Around him, his crew stared at their dead control panels in stunned silence. The Devastator, which had been one of the most feared warships in the galaxy, just moments before was now nothing more than a floating metal shell. How? He whispered. 50 years ago, when humanity first encountered alien technology, we made a decision, Sullivan explained. We would not just copy what we found. We would understand it completely and then make it better. Every piece of Cronin equipment we have ever captured, every battle tactic you have ever used, every weakness in your ships and weapons has been studied and catalogued. We know your technology better than you do. The tactical display changed to show detailed schematics of Cronin ships, including the Devastator itself. Every system was labeled in perfect detail, with notes about vulnerabilities and suggested improvements. The level of knowledge displayed was impossible. No enemy should have understood Cronin technology so completely. For 5 decades, while you believed humans were primitive farmers and traders, we were building a military designed specifically to counter every threat in this galaxy, Sullivan continued. We studied the Zephyrian bioships and created defenses against biological warfare. We analyzed Centauri energy shields and developed weapons that could penetrate them. We examined Cronin armor and built targeting systems that could disable your ships without destroying them. Vexthar realized with growing horror that humanity had been playing a completely different game than everyone else in the galaxy. While other species competed for territory and resources using established tactics and technologies, humans had been quietly preparing for a war that no one else even knew was coming. Back on Nexus Prime, the alien delegates who had witnessed the original assault were watching the events unfold through long-range sensors. The conference room had been cleared, but representatives from 32 different species crowded around viewing screens and observation lounges throughout the station. Amy Carter stood beside Jake Morrison at one of these screens, an ice pack pressed against her swollen jaw. Her diplomatic uniform had been replaced with the dark blue uniform of Earth Defense Force Intelligence, complete with rank insignia that revealed her true position as a lieutenant in one of humanity's most elite organizations. Do you think he will surrender now? Jake asked quietly. Amy watched as the human fleet maintained perfect formation around the disabled Cronin ships. Pride is a dangerous thing, Jake. Sometimes it makes people choose destruction over humiliation, Henri. The main screen. They could see Admiral Sullivan waiting patiently for General Vexthar's response. The human fleet had demonstrated overwhelming technological superiority without firing a single shot that actually destroyed anything. The message was clear. Humanity could have annihilated the Cronin fleet, but chose restraint instead. Finally, Vexthar's voice came through the communication system. The proud general who had struck a human woman just hours before now sounded like a broken old man. I surrender, he said quietly. I will face trial for my crimes. Admiral Sullivan nodded with satisfaction. General, you will be transported to the ESS Retribution for processing. Your crew will be returned to Cronin space with a message for your government. Future attacks against human personnel or interest will be met with far less restraint. Within an hour, General Vexthar was in custody aboard the human flagship. The rest of his fleet was escorted to the edge of the system and released with their engines restored but their weapons still disabled. The message they carried back to the Cronin Empire was simple. Humanity was not the weak species they had believed it to be. The aftermath of the incident reshaped galactic politics overnight. Species that had viewed humans as minor players suddenly found themselves offering trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. The Centauri Republic formally apologized for not intervening during the assault and proposed a military alliance. Even the Zephyrian Collective, which had maintained strict neutrality for centuries, sent ambassadors to discuss cooperation agreements. Amy Carter was promoted to the rank of commander and became humanity's first official galactic ambassador. Her first act in this new position was to establish the Nexus Accords, a set of protocols that guaranteed absolute protection for all diplomatic personnel, regardless of species or political affiliation. Jake Morrison received a promotion to colonel and was assigned as Amy's permanent security chief. Together, they worked to build a new framework for galactic cooperation based on mutual respect rather than fear. 6 months later, Amy stood before the full Galactic Council as they voted to grant humanity full membership status and a permanent seat on the Security Committee. The same delegates who had watched her get struck by an alien general now listened respectfully as she outlined humanity's vision for a more peaceful galaxy. General Vexthar was tried and convicted of assault against a diplomatic officer. He was sentenced to 5 years of community service working with refugee populations displaced by Cronin military actions. His empire paid substantial reparations and withdrew all territorial claims in human space. But the most significant change was in how other species viewed humanity. The galaxy had learned that humans were not primitive newcomers to be dismissed or bullied. They were a species that had spent 50 years quietly preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, and they had the technology, strategy, and determination to back up their diplomatic positions with overwhelming force when necessary. As Amy concluded her address to the Galactic Council, she looked out at the assembled representatives and smiled. The bruise on her jaw had long since healed, but the lesson learned that day on Nexus Prime would echo through galactic politics for generations to come. Humanity had claimed its place among the stars, and the galaxy would never underestimate them again.